82% of women incarcerated in our prisons today are survivors of domestic violence. In fact, domestic violence is the most common denominator, even more than race or poverty, for incarcerated adults in America. And so, what do these stark realities have to do with kids from domestic violence in school? Well, we know that kids from domestic violence make up a bulk of the kids in the American foster care system. And we also know that these same kids represent the vast majority of kids being labeled emotionally, behaviorally disordered in our public schools. And so you may wonder, what does that EBD label, emotionally, behaviorally disordered, have to do with youth incarceration? EBD youth are 13 times more likely to be arrested in school compared to other kids who've been labeled with disabilities. Now compare that to kids who have no labeled disabilities at all. And so what we know is that we can trace the practices in schools and how they set up conditions for kids from domestic violence to later end up in our prisons. So we know there is a direct connection between being a kid from domestic violence and being labeled EBD in the school-to-prison pipeline. Oops. So I am a childhood and adolescent survivor of domestic violence, and I, like many of the kids with my background, well, we were labeled emotionally broken kids from a very young age. And so today I'm here to offer a different way to think about kids like me, kids from domestic violence. And so I'm going to talk about domestic violence from a social justice perspective. And I'm also going to directly challenge the popular medical and mental health research on kids from domestic violence and trauma. And so I want you to know that when I was 6 years old, I was permanently kicked out of my neighborhood brownies troop. And I was kicked out because I resisted a violating interaction directed at me by my local neighborhood brownies troop leader. And the truth is I became almost an instant outcast in this woman's presence. I talked too much, I didn't get into line, and frankly, I resisted her often when I felt socially violated by her. Now, on one particular afternoon, this brownies troop leader decided to socially shun me, my 6-year-old self surviving domestic violence, in the worst way that a kid could be shunned. She separated me from the rest of the girls in the brownies troop as she shuffled them along to an adjacent room to sing songs in preparation for a holiday concert. And I never reached that room. She banished me to sit alone, only sharing space with partially completed styrofoam Santa Clauses that we had built earlier in the afternoon. And so my punishment was severe, and my response was equally uncompromising. And in a frenzy, I destroyed every single one of those Santa Clauses in this space. Now, thank you. Now, I resisted, there's a slide missing. I resisted that brownies troop leader like I resisted most of my teachers in my K-12 schools when I felt like they were violating me. And I want to be clear that on this day, my 6-year-old self was being violated. You know, I collapsed further under the weight of an adult educator who could neither hear me or treat me more humanely. And so my resistance to Miss Brown, this brownies troop leader, and my destruction of those Santa Clauses was not some part of my traumatized and individualized self. It was not because my brain is disordered. It was because I was resisting this educator who was violating me. Finally, we get to this slide. So this is me. This is my young self. I'm the one up front, and I'm circled by my brothers and sisters. What you can't see in this photo is that I was already being labeled an emotionally broken kid. And this is my mother. Now, she was a fierce woman, and she often showed worried facial expressions like you see here in this photo, because you see, she tried her best to protect us from the violence of my father, while she also carried that silence of being from and living under domestic violence to the larger community. And this is a picture of my mother and father and what seemed to be a normal-looking young couple starting a family. What you can't tell from these photos, though, is that we were living under domestic violence at the hands of my father and his mental illness and alcoholism. So what I'm suggesting to you is that these experiences of domestic violence not only shape me then, but shape me who I am today and how I respond when I feel violated by others. And so I see these as my cultural ways of walking through the world. And especially domestic violence has shaped who I am, even more so than being from Flint, Michigan, growing up to be a queer girl and a queer woman today, and living under working class conditions. So I think that all of those social injustices, but especially domestic violence, set me up to be a fierce 6-year-old who was not going to give in when she was feeling violated. And as I learned to resist the battles of my parents, I too, equally, if not more so, resisted the violation pointed at me from teachers and educators, be they informal or formal, throughout my K-12 school years. And it seemed to me over those years that most of these teachers, and it's not true, some of them were amazingly loving, but for most of those teachers, they could not or would not understand my resistance or have empathy for my violent home life. And so during my K-12 school years, I was labeled that emotionally broken kid. I was frequently suspended and often truant. And today, I actually believe it would be a more dangerous time for me, because today, I argue that I would have been labeled that EBD kid. And that, I want all of you to challenge yourselves to imagine what the impact on the life trajectory of a kid from domestic violence already is, but especially if their schools label them emotionally, behaviorally disordered. So in my brownie story, what this meant is that my 6-year-old self was kicked out of a community-based organization that I needed so badly, considering my violent home life. And so I make the argument that experiencing domestic violence is not so different than experiencing other social marginalization, like being raced or classed or gendered or queered. In fact, it is a major part of my identities in this world. And so what I mean by this is when you walk through the world in this way, in these ways, you read that world differently than somebody who does not have to walk through in a marginalized way. You know how to read social spaces differently and more closely and more keenly. And so for an example, if a teacher stares down a kid from domestic violence, I don't care if that teacher's behind them hovering or 10 feet away, that kid will almost always read that experience as violating. And how about we not underestimate that anyone in this theater today would not experience that situation as violating? So, our institutions and the people who work in those institutions need to be very careful when trying to label and name these kids' resistances as something broken. In fact, the impact of labeling kids from domestic violence as disordered is a metaphorical monster for their lives. The impact is staggering. And the impact on their life trajectories becomes quite clear. And so I would ask you to imagine what our schools might look like for kids from domestic violence, and how could schools think differently about the way they treat these kids. And so I'm suggesting if they choose to do that, and they should, to be more humane, they first should listen to what these kids are trying to teach us about being more humane to each other. And so an example of this would have been if that Brownies troop leader would have talked to me differently, would not have socially shunned me in front of all the other little girls, would have perhaps bent down and said, Tracey, can you try something different here? But instead, the result was that I was kicked out of this organization. And what I'll say is that we should never shut down this precious knowledge, this beautiful ability, this strength in kids to be able to tell us when we are being socially violating to others. In fact, I would encourage schools to help these kids, to mentor them, to name when they are feeling socially violated, and then to respond differently to them, and not expect that these kids will respond to the school. This is a precious knowledge. And I can imagine that if schools do this, we can change the current trajectories of these kids' lives. Now, we know we cannot unrace or unclass or ungender or unqueer a marginalized person's experience. This is also true for people from domestic violence. And I really challenge educators to consider how to relevantly respond to the cultural ways of these kids. Because if we don't, the results are profound. Educators will stay in states of ignorance, and the life trajectories for kids from domestic violence will remain severe. So the next time you see a kid acting out, be it a kid who's destroying styrofoam Santa Clauses or resisting in all kinds of ways, try not to throw them into the damage bin. Try to respond to them differently and see what they need from you. I put a challenge out there for my fellow educators. I was a teacher for 15 years in the inner city of Minneapolis. And we need to imagine our role in dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline. In fact, if we go back to the statistics I started with, it demands that schools and teachers do something very different than what they've been doing with kids from domestic violence. These kids do not need to be fixed. They do not need their brains to be ordered again. They are not disordered, even though these are popular beliefs in our society today. Rather, we need to flip the script. Understanding the resistance of kids who have survived domestic violence actually offers us a more humane way forward.